Contando.
Recording in progress.
Bom dia, bonjour, good morning. It's a pleasure for us to have you here at ANAP. This is the fourth in a cycle of 5 webinars we are having with Laboratory, Unifesp. And I'm Regina. I'm the coordinator of the graduate studies at ANAP. And that's all for now. Osmany, could you please open up the work today?
Thank you very much, Regina. Thank you. Thanks all the staff from ENAP for all their support in organizing this webinar. Thank you also Vincent and Charlotte for being here with us today. It's a great pleasure to start our fourth webinar in this cycle of events dedicated to the political sociology of public action. So I would like to remind you and reinforce what Regina said before. This cycle of events is a partnership within ENAP, within the Laboratory of International Public Policies and the program of graduate studies of the University of São Paulo in public policy and management. This cycle of webinars is meant to launch a book that we organized, me and my colleague Patrick Hassenteufel, who has been here with us in the previous webinars. And we organized this book, which is called Sociologia Política da Ação Pública, Political Sociology of Public Action. This book has the purpose to bring to Brazil all the main French approaches to policy studies, and we have translated this piece in a book, a very extensive book with 21 chapters with the major experts in the field. The book is free for you to download in PDF in the website of the ENAP, and we are going to put the link here in the chat for you if you have not downloaded your copy yet. But I wanted also to share with you some news. I would like to share with you that the book is also available for pre-order in the printed version. So if you want to buy the printed version of the book, you can make your pre-order from now on, and the book will be out in a couple of weeks. So we're going to share also the link here for you to buy your pre-order of the book, and you can have it in some time. So today we are going to have Vincent Dubois and Charlotte Halpern in this webinar. I'm going to present them very briefly for those who don't know their work yet. So Vincent Dubois is a professor at the University of Strasbourg, and he has also now a fellowship at IPEA in Brazil. He's not in Brazil, but he has this fellowship in Brazil where he's working on the lower classes and public institutions. He's going to come in Brazil soon, and he can talk a little bit more about that after his presentation or during his presentation, but he has a plan to come to Brazil in person, probably when the pandemic situation is improved. So his main research purpose is related to a critical sociological approach to public policy, where he mainly applied in the fields of culture, language, poverty, and welfare. He's author of The Bureaucrat and the Poor: Encounters in French Welfare Offices, that was published in 2010 by Ashgate. And in French, I don't know if it is the translation. He can confirm this to you because the title is a little bit different. But he's author of a very popular book in France, which is called La vie au guichet, Relations bureaucratiques et traitement de la misère. He's author of several articles in peer review and other books. And in our book in particular, he's author of the chapter 7, where he presents to us the importance of the use of the notion of field and the contributions of Pierre Bourdieu to understand and analyze public policies. Charlotte Halpern, she's a tenured researcher at Sciences Po at the Center for European Studies and Comparative Politics in Paris. And she has done a very extensive research on state restructuring, on policy change, and the selection of policy instruments, mainly in the field of environmental policies, transport, and urban policies as well, in Europe and in South America. Charlotte Halpern has co-edited a book called Policy Analysis in France, that was published in Policy Press in 2018. And this book was edited with also other two colleagues that have been participating in these webinars here. So Patrick Hassenteufel and Philippe Zitoun. And she's also she also co-edited a very important book in French policy studies, which is called L'Instrumentation de l'Action Publique, that was out in 2014 by Presse de Sciences Po. And she co-edited this book with Pierre Lascombs and Patrick Legalet. She's also one of the main experts on policy instruments and the main exponents of the French approach to policy instruments. And she's author of chapter 2 with Pierre Lascombs and Patrick Legalet, which is basically a presentation, an introduction, an invitation for you to use the policy instruments approach from the French perspective to policy analysis. So I would like to thank again Vincent and Charlotte for being here, for taking your time, for writing also your chapters on the book. This webinar is going to follow the a dynamic where we're going to have in the first part the presentations, first from Vincent and then from Charlotte. And then in the second part, we are going to receive the questions from the audience. All the questions need to be made via the chat here on Zoom or in the YouTube chat. You can opt to ask your questions in English or in Portuguese. If you opt to ask your questions in Portuguese, we are going to translate for you and then present them to the others. Just before inviting Vincent to start his presentation, I would like to also invite you to like and subscribe our channel on YouTube. This is very important for the channel, and it's also very important for you if you want to stay tuned in everything that we are doing here at the Laboratory of International public policies. There's a lot going on here about public policies, policy diffusion, development cooperation, and many more topics that you might be interested on. So with no further delay, I would like to welcome Vincent Dubois. Thank you again. The floor is yours.
Merci, Osmany. Bom dia a todas y todos. Good morning, everybody. So thank you very much for this invitation, for the invitation to participate in this very interesting book, reflective book, and second for enabling me to say a few words about my seventh chapter in this book. So I have to confess I didn't have time to prepare a formal presentation because I've been busy marking students' works and preparing the next term. So it would be a rather informal presentation and improvised one, and hopefully it would be nevertheless as clear as possible. So to briefly introduce the point by chapter, I would say that in policy analysis in general, there are, among others, at least two key questions, which are first, who makes policies? And second question, what are the relationships and the systems of relationships between the various types of actors participating in policy making? So these are very generic questions asked by many scholars in various orientations and with various frameworks and theoretical backgrounds. And to address these two questions, there are, of course, many competing notions, such as the notion of policy networks, advocacy coalition network, policy communities, epistemic communities, I-1 triangles, and so on. You know all these notions as well as I do, and perhaps better than I do. So in my chapter, my proposition is to add Bourdieu's notion of field to this already existing toolbox with two possible goals. The first one is at least to complement existing notions, and by thanks to the use of the notion of field, maybe shed light on other aspects which are not enlightened by existing notions and mostly commonly used in policy analysis. The second aim of the chapter is much more ambitious, is to propose that using the notion of field can be a way, an effective means to propose a full sociological explanation of policy orientations. So starting from this, I will try to, as briefly as possible, first maybe remind you or inform you, or those who are of you who are not familiar with this notion, what is the notion of field and what are the elements of this quite complex notion. And then in the second part of my talk, I will give you some examples of some of the possible uses of the field in policy analysis. So what is a field? A field, the social milieu, so to speak, a social space resulting from a historical process of differentiation, which is a very classic, traditional way to address changes in the division of labor, which has been started by Durkheim, Max Weber, and many others sociologists. is differentiation of functions, of tasks, of ways of functioning that gave birth to differentiated social milieux, such as the fields of sports, the fields of politics, the fields of journalism, and so on. So this is the result of the historical process of autonomization, that is the fact that these social spaces, progressively differentiated, came to function on the basis of their own rules, progressively defined within these social spaces, which are spaces of positions, spaces of positions, that is, a complex web of relationship in which the positions of individuals are defined after the structure of their resources in the Bourdieusian vocabulary, that is capitals, political capital, economic capital, symbolic capital, social capital, and so on. So the structure of capitals, of resources of the actors, which in the Bourdieusian vocabulary again are called agents. So it's a space of objective positions defined by criteria, the structure of their capital. It's a space of relationship, which is not only but mainly regarded as a space of competition. People come to compete for rare resources, in order to occupy dominating positions within the field. And so, first, I want to briefly mention that this notion of objective positions and objective relationship is different from the one which is used in network analysis, for instance, in which the relationship at network analysis deals with direct relationships. In the use of another field, we can think of objective relationship, even if people never meet in person in their lives. But I mean, being in the academic field, for instance, means that you occupy a specific position, you are located at some point in the space of academia, and that you objectively compete for positions, for trophies, to get grants and so on, even though you never meet in person, which can happen, of course, but even if you don't have direct contact with your competitors, so to speak. So in addition to that, and it's very important for my point here, is also a space of position takings, that is stances, which are also relationally defined. Each positions taking, each stance are responding one to another, and these stances are related to active positions. That is, the fact of being located at some point in the field is predictive of the kind of stance that agents are probable to take. In international relations literature, there is this famous sentence by Graham Allison: "You stand where you sit." It's more or less the same idea. Your position taking depends on your objective position. So, my proposal here is first proposal is to consider policy options as stances within the field of policy making. So what the notion of field can help us to understand is why such and such agents, such and such policy maker, such and such individual actor contributing to policy making take such positions. And second, the idea is to regard option which in the end has been selected, that is the policy choice, as precisely resulting from the dynamics of competition and relationship within the space of competition of policymaking, the field of policymaking. And in this regard, if you follow my argument, analyzing precisely this space of positions, the way it relates to position-taking stances, debate on policy options, it can prove a very useful tool to provide sociological explanation of policy choices, to the social structures in which they have been chosen, debated, and in the end selected as legitimate policy choices. Let me give you now, among many others, two examples of how we can use this notion in policy analysis at two very different. First, we can use the notion of considering a specific policy as resulting from a specific field. This is what Pierre Bourdieu himself, in a single article, has done on housing policy, and more precisely on housing policy in France in the mid-70s. So the research question is quite simple. There has been a huge shift in French housing policy at this time in 1906, to be specific. That is, it was the end, more or less the end of the traditional housing policy dating back from the post-World War II, which the most important part of housing policy was dedicated to building collective houses, to building collective accommodation and so on. And so for the state to act as an entrepreneur who directly builds these houses. So it's mainly based on the state as building houses for people in need of accommodation and collect housing. Whereas after the reform, the main orientation was much more market-driven. That is, the point was not to build houses, but I'm presenting in an oversimplified version, but it's to give you a clear example. So the point was not build new accommodations for the people, but to make them able to buy, rent apartments or house on the private market. And so, in order to do so, there has been an important and several important housing policy programs to fund, on public funds, to fund help to rent flats or to have possible loans to buy a house or an apartment. And so the question is why? Why did this shift occur? And Bourdieu's answer is that this shift has originated in the change within the specific field of housing policy making. And I want to be as brief as possible again, so I don't want to go into much details, but his main point is to show that at this time, the traditional positions in housing policy, those of bureaucrats, specialized housing, has been decreasing in favor of the promotion of new generations of civil servants who are no longer specialists of housing, but who have a general competence, general skills. So higher civil servants trained in econometric models, for instance, who made alliances between them and alliances with the private sector, the building industry, and the banking system. So it is the shift in the balance of power within this social space that explains the shift of housing policy and of policy orientations. So this is a first example, which is again a way to illustrate my general proposal. That is, this notion can help bringing a fully sociological account, if not explanation, of policy orientations. And if I have, 3 minutes left, it's a bit short, but I can illustrate another level and way to use this notion, considering this time a policy orientation as resulting from the connection between various fields. And here, if I may, I'll take an example from my own research on the rise of surveillance and sanction policies in French welfare. What I try to show that this quite new origination in the French context that that has started in the mid-90s, this quite new orientation has been made possible because of many changes in the various social fields involved at some point in the debates and in the processing of questions related to social welfare. That is, the internal logics of political competition, political field, in which welfare fraud has been promoted as a key issue, as migration or security issues have been previously, because of the shift, again, of the balance of power within the political field and the new and the emergence of new actors in the political field, competition within the right because of the rise of the far right in France, and so on. So this is the first field to consider. If we think of the journalistic field, the field of media, it has played also a key role as legitimate in a legitimization process of these policy orientations, because again of the competition specific to the field of journalism. I could add, and it's a central point in my research, changes in the bureaucratic field and in the field of social protection and of social welfare, with a new balance of power. Those who occupy positions in, finance, management, and so on, have progressively gained power over those who are the heirs of the traditional welfarist orientation, so issued from the post-Second World War era. And so my point is to show that if this change is as strong as it is in the French case, it is because it's the result from the coincidence and the connection of heterogeneous, independent logics, but nevertheless interdependent logics that brought together make this new orientation as strong as it has been. So my time is over and I stop on this last comment. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Vincent, for this very insightful presentation and this very deep presentation on the work of Pierre Bourdieu. So we now are going to move to Charlotte Halpern. She's going to talk about her chapter on the book, which is chapter number 2 about policy instruments. Thank you, Charlotte. I would also like to take benefit of this moment to thank all the translators here that are translating our speakers from English to Portuguese. So Charlotte, thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Osmany. Thank you very much indeed for the invitation. Bon dia a todos. It's great to be here, and thanks a lot also for all the effort you made in preparing the book. You and Patrick Hassenteufel. It's been a long journey, and it's a great pleasure to see it coming out. It's also a privilege to be able to present this chapter here today. Actually, I've given a presentation of an earlier version of this book at ENAPI a few years ago. I think it was December 2018, where I already had some very useful comments and feedback from some of the students participating to the IPA summer school back then. So it's great to be able to present it. And I also want to apologize on behalf of my colleagues, Patrick Hassenteufel and Pierre Bourdieu. They couldn't be here today, but they're very happy to hear also feedback and questions about the book. So this is very much a collective project. So I'm just going to share my slides. I've prepared them because I tend to speak a bit fast, so I thought it could be very useful for the audience to have them. I hope if there is anything that isn't completely clear, we'll have an opportunity during the presentations to come back to that. So I'm going to share my slides. I hope you can all see them. I'm just going to, all right, so I've changed a little bit the focus, because I think what we really want to highlight with this chapter, and more generally with the work we've done, all three of us, on public policy instruments, is to get us to think a bit differently with, on the one hand, the way through which public policy instruments constitute and contribute to the making of policy dynamics, and how it can help us think about logics of collective action. So this is what I'm going to introduce today, and I hope we'll have some time afterwards to discuss. So the main focus of the chapter is to argue that there is a great interest to look at state restructuring through the lenses of policy instruments. So our main focus really is about state restructuring and policy processes. We draw our thinking in the fact that there have been a number of implementation failures that have been observed by the implementation literature, a critique also of the political sociology of the state. And it also is very much rooted into our own empirical observations from the work we've done, all three of us, in which we saw Pierre working on environmental policies, Patrick on urban and state restructuring, myself on environmental and infrastructure planning, that very often in public policies, goals tend to become very vague. There is some blame avoidance taking place, as Christopher Hood would say, some multiple actors, some doubts about the big paradigms, and in some cases, policy instruments really serve as a sort of a policy or minimum coordination itself. So we found there was a need, in a sense, to develop a much more heterogeneous, a more concrete understanding of the state beyond the sort of grandiose conception that there usually is in the literature about sociology of the state, but also in the light of daily practices, to look at the state in action, as our colleagues Bruno Latour and Pierre Muller said a long time ago already. And in this sense, the policy instrument perspective and the way we develop it allows going one step beyond in order to analyze the state and to analyze governing practices through their material dimensions, through the way through which a policy is made operational. The way we do it is that we started by doing a brief overview of what already existed in policy studies. We know in no way want to claim that no one ever looked at policy instruments before. Indeed, there is a huge literature about policy tools in policy studies. There are some colleagues such as Peter Hall, Paul Sabatier, and Jenkins Smith, Guy Peters, Peter Linders, have been looking at policy instruments, tools, and devices, but usually they tend to focus on this particular analytical dimension as it provides a low visibility in policy dynamics. It really is considered a minor dimension. I think for Peter Hall, for example, it is considered what he would consider a third order change, and in Sabatier and Jenkins Smith's model also is something quite limited. There's also a vast literature that has developed in relationship to Harold Laswell's classic work, highlighting the fact that public policy making and policy design was often to be considered in a very pragmatic sense. That is to say that policy instruments would be contributing to a functionalist, to a very political, technical approach to problem solving. So public action in this sense as a problem solving, as a science of problem solving. And in this understanding, policy instruments are an essential dimension of the dialectical framework, but in that case, they would tend to consider it as being quite neutral. So policy instruments would be a toolbox, which is available on every occasion for public authorities. So to say they would have to go for this particular kind of legal instrument, for example, according to the Constitution, they would need to choose this particular kind of fiscal policy instrument because of the legislation about energy savings, for example, or there would also be a little room for maneuver according to existing legislations about social aid and social provisions, for example. There's a second dimension of this work, which has to do with efficiency, in the sense that this approach, which is very much rooted into a rationalist model of what public policy is about, tends to see policy instruments and the choice and selection of policy instruments as a way to seek for a perfectly adequate tool of a series of tools that would really fit policy objectives. And finally, it's also literature that really puts the focus on public policy as a need to be pragmatist. And this is particularly the view of the new policy design literature and what Howlett and Mukherjee have been writing, in which wise leaders would really rely on knowledgeable experts and policy advisors in order to adapt and to be pragmatic about the solution and the instruments that they would be selecting. Of course, I'm being a bit schematic here, and I'm happy to come back in more details and to be more refined in my analysis in the discussion, but I just want to go through and to get to the main argument. So the main stake we have on this discussion is to say that both approaches, in a sense, because it is only a low analytical approach and dimension of public policy, but also because it is very much rooted into a functionalist perspective, also prevents having a political approach, a sociological and a political approach to what the choice and selection of policy instruments is about, It tends to euphemize conflicts, power relations, but also the role of interest groups in shaping this particular process and benefiting also in terms of what it produces over time. And this is why, in order to develop this approach about public policy instruments, Patrick Hassenteufel and Pierre Bourdieu, who very much developed the first framework for this approach in a book that was published in 2004. It was an edited book in which a number of colleagues from Sciences Po and elsewhere contributed, have highlighted the fact that public policy approach was a way to go beyond policy studies in order to understand and to link the thinking about the selection of public policy instruments together with the work of Max Weber about the state being an industrial enterprise, with the work of Michel Foucault, and more specifically about policy instruments as a specific way to think about the art of governing and about the statization of society. And to look at the practices and the devices through which a legitimate authority acts on society, but also to reach out to the work done by Alain Desrosières or by Porter about large numbers, about quantification, about all the different ways through which policy instruments contribute to categorizing, to quantifying, to creating some nomenclatures through which knowledge and power is then being exercised and instrumented towards society. So what is this sociological approach to public policy instruments about? And this is very much what we develop in the second part of the chapter, where we really go into issues of definition and try to provide some more ideas about how exactly do we define this. First, we propose taking policy instruments seriously by analyzing public policy through the lenses of their instruments. So not as a third order, but really as a main analytical category, as opposed to policy objectives, for example. And we can come back to the empirical shortcomings of this approach later on, and we're by no way claiming it is useful to analyze every possible public policy process, but in some cases, and in very specific cases, it might be a very interesting and fruitful approach in order to make sense of how policy dynamics unfold over time. So taking policy instruments seriously means that we understand them as a particular type of institution that have a logic of their own. They might be framing the way problems are being stabilized, the way through which specific issues and specific dimensions of those policy problems are being prioritized over others, but also the way through which a specific policy problem is being materialized and operationalized through a specific set of tools and techniques. It is both a technical and a social device in this understanding that contributes to stabilizing the representation of a given problem, to legitimizing some actors while excluding others, but also to allow collective action and to account for it over time. And so in this context, in this sense, the choice and the selection of policy instruments is by no way a neutral activity, but it is a highly political one, which has some long-term impact on the way through which actors would position themselves and through which power is being reconfigurated over time. So following the work by Hood, more specifically, Lascombe and Le Gallès proposed defining public policy instruments in the following way: as a device that is both technical and social, that organizes specific social relations between the state and those it is addressed to, according to the representations and meanings it carries. It is a particular type of institution, a technical device with the generic purpose of carrying a concrete concept of the politics-society relationship and is sustained by a concept of regulation. This is the generic definition we've been working with, and it has then led to defining a typology of policy instruments, which I'm just going to briefly introduce here. And I very much want to engage you to read the book in order to understand and get more specific examples about this, because I won't have much time to develop this in detail, but I'm happy to come back to it later on, in which provide a typology of policy instruments which differ from other typologies in the sense that it provides a strong understanding of the relationship between government and the governed in order to distinguish between 5 different types of policy instruments: legislative and regulatory, economic and fiscal, agreement and incentive-based, information communication-based, as well as de facto and de jure standards and best practices. And each of this type of instruments refers to a specific type of political relations. So what in this particular case would be the role and the function of political institutions. So for example, the state acting as a social guardian or as a redistributive power. And also thinking in terms of the type of the legitimacy that is being drawn upon in order to justify the selection and to develop this particular policy instrument. So, for example, if we think about fiscal instruments, they would be categorized among economic and fiscal tools. They would belong to the role of the state acting as a redistributive power, which also refers to the typology by Theodore Lowy, for example, and to reorganize according to social or to territorial or to spatial criteria, the way through which resources are being distributed within society and among territories. But it also refers and is much rooted in a socio-economic efficiency type of legitimacy in which cost-benefit analysis, for example, would play quite a large role in order to understand the redistribution process, or in efficiencies that have to do with the delivery in terms of whether or not those instruments would contribute to changing and to evaluating the role of each of those groups. So those would be a very brief way to present a typology, and again, I'm happy to come back to it later on, and to introduce some of the other examples. And for those of you who've participated, or if some of you are from Brazilian University, I presented some of my work earlier on in 2018 and 19, where in which I talked more specifically about those instruments that have to do with the audience democracy, participatory devices in this case, which are the kind of tools that I've been working on lately. And this is also the kind of example that I'm happy to come back to later on. So why is this particular approach, why is it useful from an analytical point of view and a conceptual one, and what do we argue in the chapter and more generally in our work with this particular approach? Well, one of the first things we want to argue is that it provides a very precise understanding of the long-term effects of policy instrumentation. And in this case, the focus on implementation also is a way to think about how policy objectives are made operational. So to think about public policies, not just in terms of a broad series of policy objectives, and we all know that policy objectives are always beautiful on paper, but when it comes to instrumentation and implementing them, the situation is usually much more blurry. So looking at policy instruments, we can try to better understand and analyze the set of problems that is posed by the choice and the use of instruments that allow government and policy to be made material and more operational. And this is what we define in the book that we published in 2014. So in this sense, policy instrumentation involves not only understanding the reasons that drive towards retaining one instrument rather than another in a more efficiency-oriented approach, but also envisaging the effects produced by these choices. To think about both the selection and the effects of those choices later on. So in this case, regulation is not just about public ownership. It would also serve the interests of particular interest groups, for example, with long-term impact on definition of a given policy issue, or a tax credit, for example, would also contribute on the long term to benefit some social groups and economic groups versus others. And this is what we're interested to look at, objectives in relationship with the effects over time. And this allows to explore analytically and empirically the way through which the choice and the selection of policy instruments can be categorized and thought about as a highly political process with long-term effects of their own and sometimes unexpected effects, the way through which it contributes to reproduce inequalities in terms of power relations and resource distribution, similarly to some of the cases that Patrick has been working on, for example, in his work on urban policies, or my colleague Bruno Latour working on social welfare. but it is also a way to understand the diversification of forms of governing and the way through which state-citizen relationships evolve over time. And this is part of the work I've been doing on environmental public policy, especially in the EU, showing how the EU started with top-down perspective on policy action and evolved progressively towards more softer mechanisms, while at the same time still contributing to reproducing some of the inequalities that had been denounced in the previous period in terms of power relations and resource distribution among social and economic groups. So quite broadly, this is the main point we want to make with this particular approach. So I'm very conscious about the time, and because I think I only have some 5 more minutes left, I would like to come to presenting and introducing the sort of the research agenda that we have developed in the 2014 book, and on which each of us is working at the moment. The main point for us is not to create a school of public policy instruments, but what we want to do with this is really to contribute to current debates about the state and the governing of capitalist societies. So to think about state restructuring dynamics and to the concrete methods of exercising power. We want to understand how government is organized, where accountability and responsibility over different issues reside, especially in the context of extreme fragmentation and multi-level levels of government being often involved in policy making and implementation. And we also want to understand the scope for policy innovation and innovations in governance, as our colleague Jan-Peter Voss in Berlin would say. So what we try to do in the chapter, and this is the last part of the argument we make, is we try to explain what are the analytical input of the policy instruments approach, also in a critical way to take into account some of the criticisms we receive from colleagues since the publications of these books, and to also contribute to the thinking about whether or not there is a specificity of political regulation as opposed to the specificity of other tools and devices, such as market device or social device. And this brings to interesting debates with economists or with colleagues, for example, coming from the history of social techniques of sciences, but also working together with colleagues working in sociology or in other disciplines. So three different research agendas, and I'm just going to briefly introduce them. The first one is a research agenda more generally about logics of collective action. How does this focus on policy instruments and public policy instruments more specifically helps us think about logics of collective action, how it is organized and how do actors cooperate? And I guess the key question for us here is to try to understand the specific role of political regulation and political actors in a context in which market regulation and social regulation tend to take a bigger role. And in my own case, I work on policies of ecological transitions at the moment, trying to understand, for example, how to reduce the role of the cars in a number of cities across Europe, but also worked on the case of Lima in Peru, for example, where in this case, public authorities are one of the many authorities that intervene in the regulation of this particular issue, trying to cope together with market and social regulation. So the focus on public policy instruments helps us better understand and account for the way through which logics of collective actions are being organized by political institutions, and to understand also the various ways through which it coordinates somewhat, sometimes with some contradictions with market and social logics. So three different research agendas. The first one is to use public policy instruments in order to understand the restructuring of policy processes. And this is the research agenda that I've just highlighted, in which I, for example, work on the case of transition policies and ecological transition policies in the field of mobility, but also reaching out to the work done by colleagues on energy transitions, for example, trying to understand how policy instruments and policy instrumentation more particularly can be used as an intermediate variable in order to understand the structuring mechanisms in the relationship between policy instruments on the one hand and the restructuring of policy processes on the other. And in this case, it allows to work comparatively across different cases in different political contexts or different sectors and try to be a bit more systematic and through the use of this particular variable. And some colleagues of mine, such as Joan Cortinas, for example, or Jean-Pierre Le Bourris in France, have been trying to use this particular dimension in order to work on water pollutions, for example, and to develop some qualitative methodologies such as QCA methods in order to have a more systematic comparative overview of this particular approach, or we reach together with other colleagues working on this particular approach and comparatively over time. The second research agenda, which I want to introduce briefly, has to do with exploring the boundaries of public policies. And I think this is something that Patrick and Pierre have been also interested in which we try to use public instrumentation as one of the ways to delimit the borders of policy regimes. And this is something that we started working on in relationship to our colleagues in European studies or international studies, who were very much interested in understanding how public policies develop at scales that are not the national one, at the international, at the European one, where we're not talking about political authorities as such, where they are much more contested as political authorities, but nevertheless develop a number of policy instruments and public policy instruments and regulations that have long-term effects on the way through which regulations develop and contribute to political regulation being able to structure the way through which some of those problems are being addressed at those particular levels of government. So in this case, we are particularly interested, for example, in understanding how cooperation and political regulation takes place beyond state borders or in the absence of government, reaching out to the work done by Renate Mainz, for example, or by colleagues such as Tanja Bürzel or Thomas Riese, working in international relations, but also working with some of our colleagues such as Brice Laurent, who published in the book we co-edited in 2014, and who, for example, tries to think about the governing of wicked issues, taking the case of biotechnologies at the international level. So this second research agenda helps us understand what are the boundaries of public policies, especially when we think about multi-level governance perspective and the way through which, in a number of cases, public policy instruments are being introduced by authorities that are highly contested and nevertheless produce some long-term impact in terms of regulating the way through which problems are being defined, the way through actions over time. So we still believe it is a key variable in order to account for the institutionalizations of forms of cooperation. And it is particularly the case of the EU that we've worked on with a special issue that we developed together with Hussein Kassim in 2010. And I've worked on public policy instruments in the field of participatory devices with my colleagues Laurie Boussaguet and Céline Belot a few years ago, where we published also another special issue in this field. The very last one, and then I will stop, is a third research agenda, which has been developed by Patrick Le Gallès on policy instrumentation and governance, in which here the idea is to try to understand the lack of an automatic relationship between, on the one hand, policy instrumentation and the choice and the selection of policy instruments, and on the other, democratization processes. In this case, we try to work more specifically with our colleagues engaged in the comparative governance work, in which it allows us to think about the way through which new forms of legitimizing public policies and political regulations are developed, as opposed to market, or to network and social types of regulation, in which we try to understand the way through which it contributes to the evolution of political systems. So, for example, how does the development of specific participatory devices has contributed or not to reform political regimes and political systems. And this also allows to shift away from the nature of political regimes towards what do they do and what do they achieve in terms of distribution and participatory spaces. And in this case, we also reach out to the work done by Howlett and Ramesh, for example, on policy resources and political regimes, and it helps us think a bit better about new and old forms of hierarchies and try to do some work also about taking into account informal forms of governance on participation in public policy making. And this, in my case, has been extremely useful in order to understand, for example, the way through which urban public services are being developed across different political contexts, and more specifically in the case of Lima and in Peru, where I've done some research a few years ago, trying to understand how waste, water and energy services were being developed in this huge South American metropolitan area. So in this case, the focus is more on logics of politicization and depoliticization with the use of participatory mechanisms, and it allows us to have a more critical overview on how those mechanisms contribute or not to redefining the way through which those regimes and those systems relate to the governed and to their respective societies. So I will stop here for the moment. Again, I'm aware of the fact that it was quite introductory, and very happy to go more in details in the discussion, and also to answer in relationship to some of the empirical work that we've been doing recently myself, or together with some of my colleagues and with Pierre and Patrick. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Charlotte, and thank you, Vincent, for this very insightful presentations. So for the audience, if you want to start asking questions, you can manifest here from the YouTube chat or the Zoom chat. I would like to start asking one question for each. Of course, I read your chapters in the book, and one of the for Vincent, one of the things that I like in your presentation, in your chapter, is the inclusion of individuals and agents, and this perspective from Pierre Bourdieu, and something that it's not that highlighted in your chapter. Maybe you can develop or reflect here with us, is this element that Bourdieu uses in his work, which is the circulation of individuals and the circulation of elites. And my question is, how can we use this, especially to better understand public policies and policy change? There's a very interesting work that we also bring and present in our chapter with Patrick Hassenteufel and Magdalena Hadzinski about policy circulation, where which is the work of Yves Desalé and Brian Garth about the restructuring of power in Latin America. And I would like to ask you, how can we also use this idea of circulation of individuals to understand the domestic public policies? And to Charlotte, there's something that came up in the last webinar, especially from the presentation of Renaud Epstein, who also used your the notion of instruments and your work. And this is very interesting because we were discussing across webinars and across chapters with different authors. Of course, you weren't there, but we are talking about your work and your chapter, and it's related to the typology. I'm pretty sure you have these questions all the time, and we were discussing somehow the typology is really useful, but sometimes depending on our empirical object, we find some limitations. So and this is something that happens with all typologies. So I would like to ask you, what would be your advice for a student or an early researcher that is starting to work or wants to use your framework when the empirical objects require something more or needs adaptations on your typology? What would you suggest? This happened to you before, or did you change your typology across time? I know you have done field work in different countries, and obviously often this type of things happens. So maybe you can start reacting on this brief questions, and then I'm going to collect. There are a few questions in the chat, and I'm going to collect them, and then we can do another tour of questions. We can start in the order, Vincent, and then Charlotte.
Okay, thanks a lot for your question. Before directly answering your question, I would say that a possible use of the notion of field precisely is at the international level. There's an increasing number of research done at the international level in this framework, whereas it has originated in much more national case studies. But Desailly and Garth, for instance, or Antoine Vaucher or Didier Georgakakis on the field of bureaucracy, for instance, show very well how there is something as a social space that goes beyond the national borders and that can be enlightened thanks to this notion. And so we could think of precisely some kinds of fields of international circulation of policy models, and so to also take into account, which is of course very well done in many diverse researchers in policy studies, so the role of specific organizations such it's very well known, such as the OECD, for instance, or and I'm thinking of several works which are interesting in this regard. But this was not directly your question. Your question was much more about how does it impact and how could we envision so this question from the point of view of domestic policy. I would say that speaking of resources and of capitals, maybe there can be some kind of an international capital which can define the position of specific agents within the field of national policy making. And for instance, having been socialized in the European administration, and so coming back to the home country, makes that agents bring together ways of thinking, social networks, and also possibly a credit, or in the Bourdieu's vocabulary, a symbolic capital, which defines the position of these individuals within the national field of policy making. So it makes full sense to address the kind of question you asked in this regard. More generally, I would say that, speaking of policy transfer of translations of works of literature, you have to have in mind the fact that, of course, there is the international level in itself, which orients possibilities of circulation. But you also have to have in mind the specific logics of all national social organizations, that is field. I think, so, for instance, translating a book more than another has to do with the international logics of the literary field. And we could say the same thing about the fields of policy making. Why do we look at the Danish model in terms of social protection and so flexi-security, for instance, much more than at the Portuguese way of, having dealt with the economic crisis, for instance. It's an object of struggle. What is the legitimate reference in terms of international comparison and in terms of possible reference to foreign models? That could be some examples of ways to address the question you raised.
Thank you very much.
All right, so okay, so let me start, I think, with the typology and with the way through which you can work with it empirically. It's actually quite funny because I talked to Renaud earlier this week, to Renaud Epstein, and he told me about this conversation, and he told me you're going to have questions about that and the way I use it. So anyway, I'm happy to answer that. So I guess the flaw with any kind of typology is that at some point you need to define some 4 or 5 policy instrument types in this case, and try to make sure that we can generalize a little bit from the thick empirical work that can be done from one case to the other. And similarly to other policy instruments typologies, such as the one that was developed by Christopher Hood, for example, the one that was developed by Vedung, or the approaches that have been developed by other colleagues. I mean, this one has its flaws and it has its added value. In this case, the added value of the typology really is to put the focus not on policy instruments in terms of their efficiency or in terms of in terms of their nature, but rather to focus and to link together with a specific understanding of the relationship between the governing and the governed. So to relate to legitimacy issues and to relate to the specific type and role of political institutions, in this case, the state, in its relationship and the way through which it tries to impact and to change and regulate the way societies function. So this is the added value of this particular typology. So in a sense, my first advice would be for any researcher, looking for inspiration or discussion, or what would be a good approach, in a sense, to operationalize a particular research question is really to draw on this particular approach in order to understand the way through which state restructuring and state legitimacy functions and the way through which political regulation reconfigurates over time. That's one particular thing. The second way to answer your question, Osmany, is the fact that it's true that as part of my own work, because when I started working on this project, I was Patrick's research assistant. So my job was exactly this, to use the typology, which had been published in 2004, and try to make sense of it empirically. So that's what I did, and I did this working across 2 different policy sectors, environmental and urban policies, in 4 different political contexts, the EU, the UK, Germany, and France. So this is exactly the kind of issues I struggled with. I would say the first aspect is that when you code any kind of coding process entails some tough decisions about how to organize and to make sense of empirical aspects. And of course, you may never be able to completely reflect the nuances and the differences. However, having such a typology is quite useful if you want to go towards a more systematic comparative type of research agenda, and more specifically, if you want to try to think across different political contexts and policy sectors on the way through which policy instrumentations matter over time, for example. So in the case I was looking at, environmental public policies, there were indeed some nuances in the way through which, for example, participatory devices and a participatory budget was being operationalized in the French and in German context, and then in each of the different cities that were using it. But on the other hand, it remained, in a sense, a budgetary a participatory budget with some key characteristics that I then needed to highlight and to identify, try to see where were the similarities and what were the main differences, and try to understand and to include it into a broader understanding about with the combinations of other policy instruments it would be mixed and what would be the effect over time. So I think in order to cut a long story short, my advice would be to think first in terms of your research design. Maybe if you are to work and to do a monograph, for example, of a specific policy instrument, the way it emerges, its origins, and its latest dynamics, as some of my colleagues did, such as Pauline Ravinet, for example, or Sophie Jacot working on gender mainstreaming, they didn't necessarily engage in the typology itself and needed to refine it because they were just looking at one particular instrument. So for example, Sophie Jacot has argued that gender mainstreaming didn't fit in any of the 5 categories, but she new one, which has to do with instruments of coordination, reaching out to the work done by Guy Peters. On the other hand, colleagues working more systematically are needing at some point to engage with quantitative research methods, use a typology because it offers an opportunity to categorize and to classify, to code the different policy instruments, and to start using it more systematically in order to see how they evolve over time, how does the choice and selection of policy instruments evolve over time, and how it contributes to the restructuring of state legitimacy and political authority over time. And this is the kind of work I did on the EU, for example, in the field of environmental policy or in the field of participatory policies, together with my colleague Laurie Boussaguet and Sophie Jacot, Céline Belot, sorry. So that's this would be the answer I would give. And maybe just to finalize this question and to go beyond, because there is a question in the chat that I saw about within the typology, the difference between the instruments, the tools and the techniques. This is one of the main issue of contention I had myself with Patrick and with Pierre, because when you have to engage with this at a more empirical level, it becomes quite critical. But I think the main interest of this differentiation and to go all the way down and to categorize between those two different dimensions is to first assume that policy instruments never happen in a vacuum. They always need to be integrated in pre-existing policy instrument sets. So one of the key questions that you need to ask yourself is whether or not new policy instruments that were newly introduced are indeed going to reorganize pre-existing policy instruments, or whether or not they are just going to remain quite marginal. And this is one of the critiques that we had against the work by Salaman, for example, to say that it's not because you introduce a number of participatory devices that are going to reorganize the way through which a public policy functions. That's one way to answer it. The second thing is that very often a policy instrument is one of the way, a device that brings together a social and a more material dimension of a problem, but then it also links to with specific techniques, in this case, the nomenclature or the categories that you're going to use. So for example, those of you working on protected species, for example, you would have a policy instrument that would tend to zone a particular area in which you would defend and protect nature, but then you would need a specific nomenclature of what exactly are the species that you need to protect and how to categorize them, those that would be most endangered and those that would be less endangered, and so on. And then you would come to some specific tools, such as in this case, mapping, or some alert systems that would then contribute to making a policy instrument more operational. So this is the way I empirically try to categorize this, but I agree with you, it is an empirical issue, but I guess it is for each researcher, when you're using the typology and trying to code your empirical material, it's quite a classic question to be resolved. It involved some tragic choices at some points, but it is something that you can always refer and back in relationship to your research question and to your assumptions.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. Thank you, Vincent, for this first reactions to these questions. So it's always very interesting to have this inter-webinar dialogues, and happy that Charlotte could have prepare herself for what was coming today. And this is a very interesting answer, and it's also going to help a lot me with the teaching of the sociology of public action, because it's something that always come up in with the students, and this is also why I asked this question. And as you saw, there was something related to it in the chat. So I'm going to move to the questions that we have now here in the chat. So Anna from the University of São Paulo asked three questions. One was already answered by Charlotte. The other one is, if it's for Charlotte, if you think that it's possible or convenient to combine the instruments approach to the historical neo-institutionalism, especially to the perspective that analyzes processes of institutionalization as results of the interaction between social actor and the state, as the concept of fit proposed by Theda Skocpol. Instruments of public action could be modes types of institutionalization. And the other question is the difference between instruments, techniques, and tools, and this was already answered. And the other one is that you mentioned in your presentation, in your paper, a typology of 5 types of public action instruments. So could you give other examples of these types of instruments? There is another question that was made. It is in Portuguese, so I'm going to make a very rough translation here. It's for Charlotte again. It's from Ligiane Alves. She asks, considering that there is no direct relation between instruments and process of democratization, can we say that change in instruments, for example, can suggest an attempt of transformation of democratic regimes into authoritarian? Is it possible to study these processes through which it is possible? Sorry, I'm translating again. Is it possible to study the processes through which the democracy die from the perspective of instruments? And maybe we can go with this, and then we can have another round.
Right, so should I start, right? Yeah.
Yes, you can answer this, and then everyone, if you want to ask questions, please write them in the chat here on Zoom or on YouTube. We are collecting the questions, and Charlotte is going to answer these questions that were just presented now.
Okay, so that's a lot of very, very different points. All right, so let me try my best. And I think, well, especially for the difference in the typology and some different examples, maybe I think the best would be to refer maybe to the book chapter also, because then we tried to provide some examples. So I tried to go into that, but I don't want to take too much time in answering that. so that we have enough time for round the questions. So I'll try to see what I can address. So the first question in terms of how useful is this in relationship to neo-institutionalist work? So I think well, there has been a lot of work actually being done in which the public policy instrument approach has been used in relationship or in order to discuss and examine some of the historical neo-institutionalist assumptions, and more specifically the work done by Thedas Koppel, but also the work that has been done by losing memory here. Sorry, it will come back in a minute. But yeah, Kathleen Tallon and her colleagues working on state restructuring and policy restructuring. So the work that we have done and the way through which this approach can be used is a way to shift the view away from actors and interests, but to look into the way through which public policy instruments as a specific set of institutions contribute, on the one hand, to stabilizing certain representation of a problem, or to stabilize certain policy dynamics over time, to contribute to the creation of lock-in effects or to specific path dependencies, for example, but also to our understanding of policy change in a highly institutionalized context. For example, our colleague Bruno Latour, working on welfare state and welfare state restructuring, has shown, drawing and using the case of social policies, the way through which policy instruments in some cases helped understand the way stability functions and reproduces over time, in spite of efforts of some actors to change power relations and to try to influence this approach. And in this particular case, he also highlighted the way through which policy instruments highlighted a specific type of lock-in effect. So this is one of the ways I think we could think about the way through which policy instruments could be useful in order to understand this type of dynamics. Now, coming to the work and the contribution between social actors and the state, I think there again, it's a way to think not so much about the actors, but more in terms of what kind of institutions and policy instruments as a specific type of institutions as shaping the relationship between different types of actors and the way they relate to power relations, but also to the functioning of the state. So again, I think it is useful and particular and had high added value in order to explore this particular dynamic, but to a certain extent only. There are some cases, and this is the major argument that was made by some colleagues, such as Brice Laurent, for example, looking at the nanotechnology field. He used this field, this notion, and this reaches out to the work that was quoted, referred to by Vincent earlier on. Brice Laurent highlights the fact that in some cases, it is more useful to look at the role of actors rather than to stick to this institution-based approach. And other colleagues such as Philippe Zitoun, for example, have argued, or Foucault, that you've already heard probably within the realm of those webinars, also argue that sometimes the role of discourses and the role of representations and ideas is maybe more valuable in order to understand those logics and the way through which lock-in processes are being created over time and policy feedbacks are being created. So I would tend to argue that yes, it is useful, but then it depends, again, what you would like to show and the kind of research question you would have. Then the second question I had in mind was about different examples. Maybe I could take two different examples that could be useful within the scope of this discussion, which I haven't mentioned yet. One has to do with those cases in which state authorities find in a position in which they need to mobilize other actors. So, for example, you have the state trying to act through partnerships, for example, to mobilize and engage with the private sector, with social and civil society organizations in order to regulate and to structure the way through which a specific problem is being thought about. And in this case, there has been a tendency to develop and to use and the space provided by mobilizing instruments. This is a type of policy instrument which refers, for example, to partnerships, to contracts, to putting different actors around the table, and through different types of contractual agreements to get them to contribute to a policy dynamic and to align with those priorities that have been set by a given political power. And this is particularly useful in the case of the EU to understand how cohesion policy functions over time. This is something that in the French context was particularly useful also to understand the way regions function and are developed. And when I was at ENAPI, I remember that some of the students, the Brazilian students doing their PhD and those working at practitioners in specific Brazilian administrations also referred, for example, to the development of the smart city agenda and smart data as one of the fields in which contractualization and this particular type of instruments is particularly useful in order to understand both the type of power relationships, but the role and functions of state authorities in this particular context. So those would be the two different examples that would come in mind that I could develop a bit further. And about this particular example, I would strongly encourage those of you interested in this to maybe have a look at the special issue we did together with Hussein Kassim. It was coordinated by Patrick Hassenteufel and by Hussein Kassim in West European politics in 2010, focusing on the EU context. And then later on, I worked with my colleague Paolo Graziano, in which we also highlighted and focused on issues of accountability and monitoring as a type of mobilizing instrument that helps understand the long-term impact and effects of this particular type of policy instruments over the way policy dynamic entail.
Amazing, thank you. Thank you very much for this answers. So we can have another round of questions. We have one that came to Vincent. The question is, how can we make public policies fairer without favoring certain interest groups more, considering the different contexts and the realities as existing in our countries? And what do you consider the correct analytical process in designing such policies? And we have other questions to Charlotte as well. So the next one is on the literature. Are there research lines that dialogue with the use of policy instrumentation as a way to circumvent political obstacles like veto points and powerful interest groups? This question came from Marcus Paul. And Zilma Borges has another question. She made a question and prepared her question in French. It's very nice to know that we have such a nice audience that asks questions in very different languages. I don't know if I should translate, or Charlotte, if you need the translation. No, okay. And then we have another question that came from the YouTube from Eduardo Marques to Charlotte. Why separating tools, gadgets, forms, regulations of the guichet, information systems from instruments? These are more operational, but follow a similar logic and are also micro institutions. So these are the questions for this round. If you want to ask your last question for the speakers, write down in the chat here on Zoom or on YouTube. Thank you. We can start with Vincent and then Charlotte.
Thank you. I'll be brief because I think I can't really answer this question, which is much more a political one rather than an analytical one. Nevertheless, our task as policy analysts is precisely to unveil the hidden roles of such and such interest groups. And that can be our contribution to the political debate on the question of fairness in policy choices. That is maybe the way I can answer your question. So to precisely show, and here it goes far beyond, of course, the uses of the notion of field, because you can address the question of the intervention interest groups using the notion of field, but there's of course a huge literature on interest groups. This is our task. This is our task, but maybe it's our task to show that some choices are made on unfair basis. I'm not sure we have to decide ourselves what is fair or what is unfair. So it's not really an answer to your question, but it's another way to phrase it. Maybe Charlotte has an answer too.
Well,
okay, Charlotte, you can.
And then we're going to what's fair, what's not. But I agree with you, Vincent. It's more of a political question. I mean, it's. But I try to address some of the questions that came first. So just to go back mainly to the question that was asked about the way that dialogues with the use of policy instrumentation is a way to circumvent political obstacles like veto points and powerful interest groups. Okay, this could take me a very, very long way, because this is what I've been working on, especially working on large deliberation processes about environmental issues, for example, in the French context, in which there were some big deliberation processes and participatory devices that were introduced at state level under the pressure of ecologist groups, mainly to address this particular issue. Unlike some of my colleagues working in public policy, thought that and think that it is a very important device to look into. So we should definitely, as public policy specialists, look into this kind of deliberative practices and think it is one of the ways through which policy processes are being restructured. But on the other way, the empirical work I did together with my colleagues Julie Pollard and Aurélien Evra both showed that when we look at different sectors, agriculture, energy, transport, and so on, the impact and the ability through these new spaces that were opened through these policy instruments to transform and to reorganize long-term policy processes is quite different from one sector to the other. So in some of the cases we looked at policy instruments, in this sense, participatory devices, were a good entry point in order to make sense of the changes that we observed. And this was my case in the field of waste policy, for example, or the case of Julie Pollard in the case of energy efficiency in housing development. But in the case of renewable energies, in the case of agriculture and anti-pesticides, and so on, this has been quite unsuccessful in order to understand and to change the way through which those veto points function. I will also say that there is quite huge literature, many that was or that is still being developed by my colleagues from the University of Geneva and Lausanne, Frédéric Varron and Stéphane Narat, on this particular issue, and they are very much interested in the way through which a public policy instrument perspective helps understand the relationship and functions together with veto points and interest groups and their functioning in more concrete cases. So maybe those are some authors that you might want to look into. Now, coming to the question asked by Zilma in French, I think, yes, it's very important to be able to think about civil society and organized civil society as being one of the ways through which regulation entails. However, the stake we have, in a sense, with this research project on public policy instruments and instrumentation is to try to understand how does political regulation, where are the limits, how does political regulations coordinate or not, or contradict forms of regulation that entail from civil society or from the market. So in this case, we very much talk together with some colleagues, focusing more specifically on the way through which civil society organizes itself and the way through which it autonomizes itself. And we are interested in this case in understanding the way through which political regulation attempts and tries through the use of a specific type of instruments to reorganize, to change, to challenge the way those forms of organizations are developed. And in this case, we very much dialogue together with some of the work that has been done with colleagues in sociology, such as Renate Mainz or Koyman, as the more historical work I can quote, but it can also refer to some of the work being done at the moment with some colleagues working, for example, the field of energy consumption or energy resources or climate change activism, such as Jan-Peter Voss or other colleagues from the Technische Universität in Berlin, who work in a more science and sociology perspective, understanding the way through which such developments take place outside the control of political regulation or outside the realm of government, and the way through which governments, through specific sets of intervention, tries to reorganize and reprioritize the way through which those initiatives function. So this is something I'm very much interested in, but this particular approach, because it tries to question, at the end of the day, the role of political regulation, looks at these initiatives coming from civil society or from the market as being something else, and try to understand the interfaceable relationship between those. And finally, coming to Eduardo. Well, Eduardo, it's good to know you're behind YouTube. I'm sorry I can't see you, but it's nice to have this opportunity to chat anyway. Why distinguish between those two? My understanding of it, and coming back to the answer I gave before about the use of any typology, and I see this as part of the work I did, trying to go from more qualitative to quantitative methods, and specifically if you use mixed methods, is that if you distinguish between policy instruments on the one hand, tools and techniques on the other, it is an opportunity to categorize and to code differently the way you're going to think about those policy instruments. So yes, for example, a specific type of a form is a different way to think at the way through which power is being made material in a daily practice. But on the other hand, the instrument itself is still about redistributing, for example, resources from one part of society to the other, and the way it is made material is through a specific tool, which in this case would be a form, which helps it make it material. But it could also be done through a specific modeling system. It could be done through a scenario planning tool. It could be done through a number of other tools. And what interests us in this particular context is to understand the specific effect and the effects that are generated by the combination between, on the one hand, a given policy instrument, in this case, a redistributive one, in close relationship with a form. And this is part of the work we've done that has been done, for example, by Sophie Jacot, working on gender mainstreaming, or my colleague, also Marine Bourgeois, working on the way through which anti-discriminatory measures are being implemented by the administration on location, so au guichet. And the way through which an interpretation of a particular problem is being made through the forms and through the administrative papers that are being used, but nevertheless within the scope that has been structured by a policy instrument that remains a redistributive one. And this leads to favoring some groups over others, but within the realm of this particular policy instrument. So this would be one of the ways to answer your question, Eduardo. Just to say, maybe, sorry, that I'm still playing the devil's advocate, because you're trying very hard, to defend this typology between the instrument, the technique, and the tool. And I know there are some examples where it is very fruitful, but empirically, I agree, it is not that easy to implement. So I always need to say this, especially for those of you who are struggling with it.
Amazing, thank you. Thank you, both of you, for this very nice replies and for such a stimulating discussion. There's a last question to Charlotte that came in the chat, and we can conclude with this one. So it's from Thelma Hoyler. She says, could you develop a bit further, maybe with examples of your own work on how types of instruments and types of political relations leads to types of legitimacy? As Weber is a departure point to develop the instrumentation framework, the typology is a good point to arrive, as it depends on his own categories on state legitimacy and allows comparisons. But I miss the conflict, the contestation that is in the instrumentation framework, of course, but it's not represented in the scheme presented.
Right, so hello to Thelma also. I hope you're well, Thelma. It's nice also to you. I haven't, yeah, anyway. So, all right, so just to give maybe some points, I think one of the things I've been working in my own work, and this is what I've been doing as part of what we call the habilitation in France, the HDR, working more specifically on policies of ecological transitions, working more specifically in the field of urban mobility and trying to understand how the role of the car is being reduced. And in this particular sense, what I found and the way I use policy instrumentation is one of the ways to understand logics of resource accumulation within a given metropolitan authority. So we're talking here about some metropolitan authorities, which in the European context, I'm working here in countries in which we're talking about strong, powerful, centralized states, which historically have struggled against decentralizing some of their powers. We're talking about the UK, we're talking about Denmark, we're talking about France, been struggling against their cities to give them more power. So part of the work for those cities in order to engage more actively into reducing the role of the car and working in order to gain more powers in the field of urban mobility has been to draw on the accumulation of policy resources. And in order to demonstrate that empirically, I argue, and this is one of the points I make in this particular work, that this is not so much to be explained through the circulation of new ideas and the circulation of new models, nor is it to through specific interest groups and struggling for this changed paradigm to take place, but rather to a continued process of policy resource accumulation over time. And this is something that I can demonstrate through the use of a specific combination of policy instruments over time. So just to cut a long story short, let's just say that on the one hand, yes, there is struggle and contestation, Thelma, because in the sense, in the case of the city of Paris or the case of the city of London, we're talking about 40 to 50 years of hard, very strong contestation and conflicts with the national state. So we're not talking about street conflict, we're talking about the mayor of Paris and London trying to struggle against the national state. In the case of Margaret Thatcher, for example, this came so far that she just decided to get rid of the mayor. So we're talking about quite hard conflicts in this sense. In the case of Denmark as well, it gave way to a number of conflicts between different levels of political authorities. This approach is also a way, for example, to put at a distance the role of cyclists, for example. Yes, cycling groups have been quite useful and powerful in shaping the way through which urban mobility is being reorganized, but it's just one of the ways to organize and to account for the changes over time. And this is what I show by drawing on this work on policy instrumentation and highlighting the fact that without this constant work of policy resource accumulation on the side of political institutions, public policies would never have managed, in a sense, to reconfigure the public space and the way it is being operated at the urban scale. And what's quite interesting is that, of course, you could always argue that this is something that is particularly useful in European countries, in which we'll be looking at centralized states and the way through which conflicts have led to reorganizing and reconfiguring power relations between levels of government and to the growing legitimacy of urban authorities. But the work I've done compares those kind of states with more federal states still in Europe. So for example, Austria and Germany, where cities always had some strong power and where there again, they have learned to invest this particular field, policy field. And here the conflicts are between car drivers, bus drivers and cyclists, for example. But looking into to other political contexts, such as South America. I know that some of my colleagues working in Santiago in Chile, or colleagues working in Belo Horizonte in Brazil, or others working in Lima, have shown that indeed this is one of the ways through which we can think and account for these particular processes. So again, it draws on the work by Weber, and there you can also look into the book that was done by Adams and Kniel in 2019, where they also argue that this process of policy accumulation takes place over time, and part of this policy resource accumulation is accounted for by policy instrumentation themselves under the combination between public policy instruments. So I'm not saying it works all the time, not saying it is the only way to account for those processes of change, but in the particular case that I've been looking at, I think it is one of the ways to account for the growing legitimacy of highly contested authorities, in this case the urban authorities, trying to structure a new policy field, urban mobility, at this particular level against those technicians and officials and engineers that were mainly organized at the national level, as well as against some interest groups that until a very recent time all believed they only needed to lobby the regional authorities such as the EU or the national state authorities in order to change regulation, and now have started to understand they also need to position themselves more at the urban level. So it is one of the ways I argue to understand those processes. So sorry for the long answer to Tama's question, but it was one of the ways to illustrate that and to show that indeed when we talk about conflicts and contestation, we need to have different types of conflicts in mind. Could be the cyclists, could be some local grassroots groups, but it could also be some pretty strong institutional conflicts between different levels of authorities that we see more and more happening in a number of countries in the field, and trying to understand how specific policies are being developed. And for some political authorities, legitimacy can only be increased through high levels of political contestation, and policy instruments offer one of the ways to understand how those processes occur over time.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. I don't know if you have anything else that you would like to add. Otherwise, we can start concluding. Vincent, would you like to add anything? Charlotte?
No, that's fine.
Okay.
Thanks
so
that's the only thing.
Thank you very much again for being here today with us. I wanted to start closing this webinar by saying that next week on Thursday we are going to have the last of the 5 webinars where we will have the participation of Eva Foucault. She's going to discuss global public policies. We are also going to have Carla Tomasini, who's going to discuss the role of ideas and in public policies from the French perspective. We are also going to have Thierry Delpech, who is going to bring his perspectives on law and public policies. It's going to be an amazing webinar. You are all invited to be with us. It's going to be on the 24th of June at 10 o'clock Brazilian time. You can see in the chat here on Zoom the link for you to register if you want to have the participation with the translation from the English to Portuguese. You can also watch this without any registration from our YouTube channel. I just wanted to remember you that all videos are going to be available on YouTube, and you can also download the book for free on the webpage of ENAP if you have not downloaded yet. If you want the printed copy of the book, you can make your pre-order in the website with the link we just shared in the beginning of the video. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And I would like to thank finally Vincent and Charlotte for this wonderful presentations, for these very nice discussions. I would like also to thank the ENAP staff, Regina, for all her support. I would like to thank the translators for their great job done today. And of course, I would like to thank also the public, my students who are coming here to watch this webinar, to ask hard questions for the speakers and to stimulate the discussion. So thank you, everyone, and see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.